All right, so in the previous slide, we talked about how innovative and how revolutionary Jacksonian democracy or Jacksonian freedom was back then. Okay, we really led the entire world in extending suffrage, the right to vote, to even the poorest male. Now, again, emphasis on male, it's still gendered. Women, as you might know, won't be extended suffrage until the 19th Amendment. That takes place in 1920. That's almost a century in the future, right? From when Jacksonian takes root in a country, Jacksonian freedom, that is. Okay, so again, it's very innovative still, okay, despite the fact that it is still exclusionary. And here we see a redefinition of not only republic citizenship, but even the way political culture is now exhibited. Okay, think about this. If you are trying to attract the vote of the popular masses, right? How are you going to attract them if they're not educated? They really don't understand. I'm not claiming everyone doesn't understand, right? But it is likely true that the broad masses really don't understand what's at stake because they're too busy trying to eke out a living and survive, right? And again, this is before public education, where people really, didn't know how to, think about politics as much. Okay, so how are you going to attract the votes of those individuals, those voters? Well, what happens is a change in political culture again, right? It's redefined now uh, where the person running for office has to exhibit a popular touch, so to say, a popular touch. That is, he has to really appeal to the masses. Okay, he has to use rhetoric uh, that will try to attract voters, right? He has to even slander his opponent, his political rival, using scandal or what have you, calling him names, right? This is when politics gets really dirty. It's always dirty before, okay, Jacksonian freedom, as he kind of acknowledged earlier, right? But it becomes even more dirty with more mudslinging, right, at your opponent. Okay, why again? Because you're trying to attract the vote of those who are less savvy, right, and don't possess the acumen, right, the knowledge to understand politics. Okay, and by the way, Jackson himself, his nickname was called, or his nickname was Old Hickory. Okay, and that in itself kind of underscores the degree to which, he was the popular person, right? He wasn't part of the so-called, elite that we think of when we think of Jefferson and, wearing the powdered wigs and the knee breeches. Jackson did none of that. Okay, he's a frontiersman, right? Okay, and because of that, he attracts the popular vote, right? And by the way, this popular touch, so to speak, still is essential today. You probably know this, right? When you think of the term populism, which is widely circulated nowadays in political discourse, right? You're talking about how, a person running for office uses his or her rhetoric to attract the masses by, appealing to what their sensibilities as, the lower classes of society, even, right? And therefore, it's you're doing it deliberately, right, to gain their vote. Okay, and like I said, it's part of American culture now. It redefined political culture in the United States. Jacksonian freedom, that is. Okay. Now, one thing to acknowledge, I just mentioned that Jacksonian is still exclusionary. Well, that's because it excludes no longer based on social class, as mentioned here, right? Class. And when you think of social class, think about, your socioeconomic status. Back then, as I mentioned, it used to be connected to land ownership, right? Now you eliminate that qualification, but it is still exclusionary in terms of race and gender. So you look at this argument here as democracy triumphed, or let's call it Jacksonian democracy triumphed. The grounds for exclusion shifted from economic dependency to natural incapacity. So, how do we analyze that in terms of race, gender, and social class? Well, hopefully it's clear to you that, as I just mentioned, social class is now eliminated as the main condition, right? Or conditions based on social class, I should say. And namely, back then, land ownership, property, right? Ownership of property. Now that's no longer a necessary condition to be part of politics, right? You can vote regardless of whether you own land or not. But is democracy in our country in the 1850s and moving forward still exclusionary? Yes, but it shifts from being based on social class to that of race and gender. And how do they do this? Well, persons of color, and namely at the time this meant persons of African descent, certainly slaves, right? But even free blacks, and also women, which is like half the population, right? When you think about it. Right? So it's still exclusive in terms of gender. As I mentioned previously, they won't get the right of suffrage until 1920. Okay, so hopefully you could make sense of this in terms of the shift, right? And by the way, what do you mean by natural incapacity? Well, this is really the rationale behind why those persons belong to a different race other than white, or the other sex, the other gender, why they should be eliminated. It's because it's felt that they naturally were lacking the capacity to understand democracy. Okay, it's felt to be natural, like it's just they have no disposition, right? No acumen, no understanding, have no capability of understanding democracy. It's felt that women, and let's remember the doctrine of separate spheres I just discussed, women, right, were the moral guardians of the home, right, but they were also thought to be intellectually inferior, so therefore they should not participate in public affairs outside the home, right? And public affairs includes politics, not just economics, like, in the world of work, but political affairs. So they should be excluded from that, right? Okay, so that refers to the natural incapacity, so to speak, of women, right? This is the prevailing belief back then. They just took for granted. Same with race. It was felt that persons of color were incapable of standing democracy, let alone practice it. So they should be excluded as well. So this is what this argument means. Again, we see democracy triumph, and it spreads throughout the country, Jacksonian freedom. But our democracy is still exclusionary, but it is no longer based on social class, that is to say, economic dependency, but it still is exclusionary. The exclusion or grounds for exclusion shift, right, from social class to race and gender here. And that's what that statement means. All right, now the final topic, or subtopic rather, that we're going to discuss in this topic of Jacksonian freedom or Jacksonian period is Indian removal by 1830. Okay, this happens during Jackson's administration, Jackson's time in the executive office. And what's happening here, if you see this map, right, there are these Indian civilizations around here. In fact, the dominant civilization, they call themselves the civilized tribes. Okay? And they call themselves the civilized tribes because, they actually assimilated to some of American culture, or broadly understood as Western culture, right? For example, they established schools, they adopted written laws, some of them even had constitutions, right, based on the U.S. Constitution. And there were successful farmers in this region here, okay? And 5 civilized tribes were the Chickasaws, Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, and the Seminoles, okay? Those are the 5 civilized tribes that occupied this region in what we call today much of the Delta South, right? And extending down to Florida even. Now, what happens here by the 1820s is that Jackson wants to remove them. Okay, he wants to remove this land, and a big reason why, besides conflict, right, and besides them being a barrier to American expansion westward, is that um, well, here was a good region to extend uh, cotton plantations, right, to extend the cotton economy. Okay, because before, as seen in this map, well, these Indians, so to speak, right, occupied this area. Therefore, we had to undergo Indian removal, right, according to Jackson. So this is what happens. And to be honest, the Supreme Court, with two previous decisions, they were on the side of the five civilized tribes. Okay, but basically Jackson just forced the issue, and he basically used his presidential powers to force the dislocation and removal of these five civilized tribes all the way here to what's called Indian Territory, and they also called it the Oklahoma Territory. Okay, so this is what happens during the 1830s with the Indian Removal Act. You see the uprooting and again the dislocating of the five civilized tribes. You know, this is a population of more than 60,000 in the states we see here, right? Like Florida and Alabama, Mississippi. And again, they're forced to be removed. So this happens during especially 1838 and 39, where they remove Indians from their ancestral lands. For example, in the Trail of Tears, you see 18,000 men, women, and children rounded up and forced to march west. By the way, 25% of these evacuees, right, died on the Trail of Tears. Okay, you may have heard of the Trail of Tears, right? It's this right here marked in the red arrow. So you see these Indian civilizations moving west, right? So they all leave at certain points during the 1830s, and eventually this place was evacuated. Now, what happens here is the conversion of this soil from Indian soil, so to speak, to slave soil, meaning you're going to see cotton plantations arise and slaves work in that region. Okay, so again, Indian removal was thought to be essential here and a big project of Jackson, which quite frankly, he was successful at it, but it led to the inordinate loss of life among Native Americans. Some estimate that somewhere between 20 and 30,000 may have perished altogether, right, throughout the 1830s in Indian removal of all these civilizations moving to the Oklahoma region.